All right, well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It's great to see all of you, especially here toward the end of the semester. My name is Dr. Stephen Scoltetti. I'm the director of the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom here at the University of Mississippi. The mission of the Declaration Center is to ensure that students and faculty and members of the community have opportunities to think carefully about the nature of American freedom. We're operationalizing that mission in a number of ways. For students, in particular, we support a Freedom Studies minor as well as Freedom Studies classes. We also offer a Freedom Studies scholarship, and just a reminder to any students here who have friends, the new application deadline for the Freedom Scholarships in the fall is August 28th. And information about those scholarships can be found at our website, independence.olemiss.edu. We also sponsor faculty research. And finally, we put on lots of different public events like tonight's event. I do want to, before I introduce the speaker, just say a quick word of thanks to the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History, whose support made this event possible. And then I'd also like to thank our speaker for making the trip here from Canada. It's a pleasure. I'm happy to introduce to you Dr. David Wilson. He is a professor of history at the University of Toronto. He's published numerous journal articles and a number of books. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. And so please join me in welcoming him as he delivers his lecture, When the Far Left Meets the Far Right, 18th Century Woke Politics and the Origins of American Populism.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone. And special thanks to you, Stephen, and you, Rankin, for making this happen. And you, Nathan, for looking after me so well. And everyone here for showing up, especially at this time of the year when I know things are particularly busy. T.S. Eliot knew what he was talking about when he said, April is the cruelest month. So when the far left meets the far right, 18th century woke politics and the origins of American populism. Well, words such as woke and populism are nebulous. They are capable of multiple meanings, and they're ideologically loaded. They often reveal more about the definer than the defined. So precisely because of that, it's important to clarify how they're being used here before assessing their relevance, if any, to the early years of the American Republic. So populism. Populism can take many forms, and it can serve many masters, from communists to fascists to corrupt politicians on the make. One of its central characteristics is anti-elitism, with the elite as a moving target. So it could consist of capitalists, landowners, intellectuals, members of an ethnic, racial, or religious group, you name it. Sticking it to the man is a common feature, whoever the man or the woman might be. Populism is fueled by appeals to the emotions rather than reason. It glories in providing simple answers to complex questions. Anti-intellectualism is part of its lifeblood. It involves distorting reality to suit your own purposes, to appeal to the prejudices that your audience may hold and that you might well hold yourself. It is particularly effective when it takes and twists things that have an element of truth. As they say in Ireland, half the lies are true. Stereotyping the other is a particularly effective weapon. So you take the most objectionable feature of the other side and you generalize from that about the whole group. That is part of a repeating pattern. And it's often accompanied by ad hominem attacks on all those who are designated enemies. Populism is often, but not always, associated with upholding traditional values, however they are defined, with going back to an imagined past or fast-forwarding to a utopian future, or both, when the utopian future is sought through the medium of the imagined past. Threats and conspiracies are perceived to be everywhere. The lack of evidence for any such conspiracies is often taken as proof that they exist, that the conspirators are adept at concealing their plots and their plans, and the need to resist that is imperative. The threats are frequently associated with outgroups. For example, Irish Catholics coming into Protestant America during the 19th century, or Jewish refugees from Russian pogroms coming into Western Europe during the 20th century. Fears abound that our way of life is being undermined by immigrants, legal or illegal, with different values, different beliefs, different religions. And running through all of this is a sense of urgency, the conviction that the stakes are very high, that the future hinges on the actions of the present. The emphasis is on the battle to come, after which everything will be made right again. As we shall see, many, but not all, of these features characterize the polarized politics of late 18th century America. Populism, as I'm defining it. The term woke originated, as I'm sure you know, in African American culture to signify an awareness of racial prejudice and discrimination. It's broadened out to encompass a variety of social justice causes, such as defunding the police and asserting transgender rights. It's underpinned by anti-capitalist ideologies that critically analyze society in terms of white privilege, systemic racism, and settler colonialism, and it values identity politics over and above John Stuart Mill-style liberalism. On the right, it's become a term of abuse, signifying pretty much anything you don't like. Clearly, all this is far removed from the ways in which late 18th century people and politicians viewed themselves and their society. So I want to make that as clear as possible. It would be ahistorical and unhistorical to make the transposition. And yet, there is a certain affinity between the mindset of late 18th century democratic radicals and woke radicals of today. The content may be different, but the form is similar. Both groups saw themselves as attaining a higher level of consciousness. Both groups exhibited a sense of absolute moral certainty, and both groups wanted to remake the world on what appeared to be principles that no decent or reasonable person could oppose. Who, after all, could possibly disagree that diversity was a good thing, that equity was a good thing, that inclusivity was a good thing? Or, in the age of the French Revolution and the early American Republic, what reasonable person could possibly disagree that liberty, equality, and fraternity should be the basis of a just political society? Well, only those who are privileged or ignorant, obviously. The privileged needed to be overthrown. The ignorant needed to be re-educated. We all know, or we should know, where that kind of thinking can lead. The seeds of totalitarianism lie within systems of thought characterized by absolute moral certainty, making the world over again, dreaming of utopia. Whether or not those seeds germinate depends on context. Context is crucial, and the context that we're dealing with in the 1790s is the French Revolution. Against the background of blood, terror, and total war, Thomas Jefferson, in his capacity as Secretary of State, admonished the Chargé d'Affaires in Paris for being too critical of the revolutionaries. Quote, The liberty of the whole earth was depending on the contest. Rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than as now it is, unquote. As Conor Cruise O'Brien pointed out, this is the language of Pol Pot. Jefferson was not alone, though. His view that massive loss of life was an acceptable, if regrettable, price to pay in the quest for liberty found plenty of echoes elsewhere. When the Irish revolutionary Wolfe Tone arrived in Philadelphia in 1795, he didn't much like the living and breathing Americans he met. They were, he wrote, in private, a disgusting race, eaten up with all the vice of commerce. But he loved their system of government, which brought affluence and ease, as he put it, to all the citizens. These are the things, he wrote, for which the lives of thousands and tens of thousands are a cheap purchase. The English radical and chemist Joseph Priestley, who emigrated to the United States after his laboratory had been destroyed by a Church and King crowd in Birmingham, England, thought along the same lines. By 1797, he feared that polarization between supporters and opponents of the French Revolution was putting the United States on the brink of civil war. Although he was confident that the forces of, as he put it, luxury, vice, and folly, unquote, would be defeated. And then he wrote this, again privately, "Many lives, no doubt, will be lost in war. Many lives, no doubt, will be lost in war, civil or foreign. But men must die. And if the destruction of one generation be the means of producing another, which shall be wiser and better, the good will exceed the evil, great as it may be, and greatly to be deplored, as all evils ought to be. Men must die, if the destruction of one generation be the means of producing another which shall be wiser and better, the good will exceed the evil. If. It was exactly this kind of thinking that lay behind Edmund Burke's attack on the French Revolution, well before the guillotine started falling and Jefferson and Tone and Priestley made their remarks. "I have no great opinion," he wrote, "I have no great opinion of that sublime, abstract, metaphysic reversionary, contingent humanity, which in cold blood can subject the present time and those whom we daily see and converse with to immediate calamities in favor of the future and uncertain benefit of persons who only exist in an idea." Burke, Reflections on the Revolution, 1790. But the imagined future exerted a powerful hold on the actual present. During the 1790s, the stakes seemed very high indeed, nothing less than the survival and character of the new nation, the United States of America. Among the strongest supporters of the French Revolution were the democratic societies that emerged in 1793 to protect the United States from international counter-revolution and internal monarchical and aristocratic tendencies. Emanating from Philadelphia, drawing considerable support from the middling orders of society, they stood for universal male suffrage, economic liberty, and a broadly egalitarian society. They embraced the styles and the slogans of revolutionary France. They went around greeting each other as citizens. They wore caps of liberty. They sported red, white, and blue cockades. They attended civic feasts celebrating the triumph of French armies over the leagued despots of Europe. They injected a spirit of secular millenarianism and egalitarianism into American politics. This was revolutionary indeed, a revolution within the revolution. In imitation of the French revolutionary calendar, in which 1792 became year one of the Republic, the Democratic Society in Philadelphia began to date its resolutions from America's own year one, 1776. Thus, 1794 became year 18 of American independence. The calendar was to be revolutionized. Taken together, the American and French revolutions would sweep away the accumulated rubbish of ages and begin the world over again. If we're looking for a version of woke culture in the early republic, this is where we'll find it. Radical democratic politics began to permeate the 18th century equivalent of social media. Broadsides, easy to produce, pamphlets, easy to produce, newspapers, plays, street theater, songs, schools. Language itself was to be revolutionized. In a prize-winning essay delivered at the American Philosophical Society in 1793, a prize-winning essay, the Scottish immigrant William Thornton insisted that Americans shake off English linguistic imperialism by abolishing the existing alphabet, the alphabet as we know it, and replacing it with a rational system based on the phonetics of liberty. You have already taught a race of men, he wrote, you have already taught a race of men, you have already taught a race of men to reject the imposition of tyranny and have set a brilliant example which all will follow when reason has assumed her sway. You have corrected the dangerous doctrines of European powers. Correct now the languages you have imported. For the oppressed of various nations knock at your gates to be received as your brethren. The American language, which he puts in capital letters, the American language will thus be as distinct as the government, free from all the follies of unphilosophical fashion and resting upon truth as its only regulator. William Thornton, 1793. Noah Webster didn't go quite as far, in fact, few people went as far as William Thornton, but his new dictionary for the New Republic caught the spirit. So to spell plow, P-L-O-W, instead of the English P-L-O-U-G-H, or to omit the silent U from words such as honor and labor, was a declaration of American independence from Old World obscurantism. Meanwhile, his friend Benjamin Rush wanted a new medicine for a new world. Unfortunately, it involved bloodletting to treat all fevers, but that's another story, and honestly one that I'd rather not tell. Language was to be transformed. Medicine was to be transformed. Gender relations were part of the American Cultural Revolution of the 1790s. The word citizen was intended to replace traditional honorifics such as Mr., Mrs., and Miss. And to ensure gender equality, a new word was coined for female citizens, citess. As early as 1790, an article in the Philadelphia Aurora, this is edited by Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache. An article in the Philadelphia Aurora in 1790 complained that women had been written out of history and called upon them to claim full civil, political, and social equality with men. This was a full 2 years before Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her vindication of the rights of women. In the epilogue to her play, Slaves in Algiers, the English immigrant Susanna Rowson teased her audience with the closing words of the play, "Women were born for universal sway, men to adore, be silent and obey." The play, it should be noted, was not about black slavery, about which the radicals were conflicted, but rather about white American slaves in North Africa attempting to escape to the land of liberty. In 1798, the play Female Patriotism, written by the United Irish immigrant John Daly Burke, reinvented Joan of Arc as a French revolutionary heroine with a mission to bring liberty and equality to a benighted world. In the end, though, victory against the English assured, she returned to a life of domestic bliss. Female patriotism clearly had its limits for John Daly Burke. The spirit of revolution and the celebration of revolutionary violence were everywhere. They characterized street theater. They characterized popular songs. While pools of his patient's blood were accumulating in Benjamin Rush's front yard, as they were, symbolic blood flowed through the streets of Philadelphia. Louis XVI was guillotined 20 to 30 times a day in a show that attracted men, women, and children for weeks in the winter and spring of 1793. The following year, John Jay's effigy was guillotined up and down the eastern seaboard after he signed a treaty of rapprochement with Great Britain. Meanwhile, Joel Barlow decided to rewrite Britain's national anthem, God Save the King, which became, first verse, I will not give you the whole thing, but you get the message. God save the guillotine. Tell England's king and queen, her power shall prove. Tell each anointed knob affords a clipping job. Let no vile halter rob the guillotine. Not to be outdone, the Democratic Society of Philadelphia included among its toasts the guillotine to all tyrants, plunderers, and funding speculators. Statues came crashing down. In Charleston, the statue of Lord Chatham was pulled over and decapitated, guillotined. In Christchurch, Philadelphia, a bust of George II was taken out. Street names were changed. In New York, Queen Street became Pearl Street. King Street became Liberty Street. In Boston, the Royal Exchange Alley became Equality Lane. In schools and universities, education became increasingly politicized. Republican principles were being written on the supposedly blank slate of young minds. At the University of Philadelphia, a teacher decided to improve upon Shakespeare by rewriting the peroration of Henry V's speech at the siege of Harfleur. The original words, "Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry God for Harry, England, and St. George," now became, "Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry God for freedom, France, and Robespierre." University of Pennsylvania, mid-1790s. Beginning the world over again. Beginning the world over again. Policing language, transforming gender relations, cheering on revolutionary violence, pulling down statues, changing street names, politicizing education. As the historian A.T.Q. Stewart wrote in a totally different context, everything is older than we think it is. Almost inevitably, there was a backlash. Almost inevitably. And that backlash found its most powerful and popular expression in the writings of a man whose American career has been almost completely forgotten today, which I find very interesting, but who was actually the most widely read pamphleteer and journalist in the United States during the 1790s. He's not even mentioned in most histories of the United States, but he was the most widely read pamphleteer and journalist in the country in the 1790s. The man in question was a former agricultural laborer and soldier from England who had once been a supporter of Tom Paine, who had moved from the far left to the far right, who declared war on what he described as all the hell of democracy, and appealed with stunning success to the consciousness of Englishness among Americans. His print shop in Philadelphia defiantly painted a Tory blue, where, by the way, he had pictures of Marat and Franklin juxtaposed to one another in his windows. His print shop in Philadelphia became the hub of counter-revolutionary populism in the United States. William Cobbett was his name. William Cobbett arrived in the United States in 1792. He wrote to Jefferson, saying that he was, quote, ambitious to become the citizen of a free state, unquote, and believing that this was the one place in the world where Republican principles actually worked. He was quickly disillusioned. The United States, he informed a friend in 1794, was, quote, exactly the contrary of what I expected it. The land is bad, rocky. The seasons are detestable. The people are worthy of the country, a cheating, sly, roguish gang. Now, many other British and Irish Republicans who came to the United States felt exactly the same way, something that really struck me when I was doing research on other topics. But they drew sharp distinctions between the character of the country, which they generally thought was dreadful, and its political system, which they viewed as a model for the rest of the world. Cobbett made no such distinction. Instead of that perfect freedom of which Paine had given me so flattering a description, he wrote, I found myself placed under a set of petty, mean despots, ruled by a perversion of the law of England. For 2 years, Cobbett kept his views to himself. Then, in 1794, Joseph Priestley arrived in New York to a hero's welcome as a refugee from political persecution in England, who was welcomed for finding an asylum of liberty in the United States. Cobbett could take it no longer. He rushed into print. Democrats like Priestley, he wrote, were system mongers. His words, system mongers, who tried to make circumstances conform to their visionary theories, instead of making their theories conform to circumstances. The inevitable result of such an approach, he argued, was revolutionary terror, the oppression of the people in the name of the people with a capital P. Democracy was dangerous. It opened the door to, block capital letters here, crawling demagogues and popular parasites who pandered to jealousy, envy, his words, jealousy, envy, revenge, and every passion that can disgrace the heart of man. Left unchecked, he argued, democracy would destroy freedom of property and freedom of speech. Not only that, but democracy would undermine the Christian basis of morality that was essential to civilized behavior. Lacking a strong religious foundation, the United States was becoming a corrupt, immoral, and dishonest society. Traditional values were under threat. All this talk of rights, especially of women's rights, was undermining the mutual obligations, the duties, the feelings of affection that ought to exist between husband and wife. The husband would provide for and protect the wife. The wife would honor and obey the husband. Each would respect and love the other. That was the basis of society, not rights. There was the ideal, and then there was the reality. Later in life, Cobbett's wife attempted to commit suicide, and all his children turned against him. That is another story. Without stable property relations, without established religious values, without traditional familial values, there was no social cohesion. Without social cohesion, there was only the war of all against all. Democracy then was the very antithesis of liberty. Democracy was the ingratiating mask that concealed the reality of narrow self-interest and ambition. Nowhere was this clearer in Cobbett's view than in the contradiction between the language of liberty and the reality of slavery in the American Republic. When he saw newspaper reports of civic feasts celebrating liberty right next to advertisements for, quote, 2 Negro lads, unquote, and a pregnant 18-year-old Negro wench, quote unquote, for sale, he went for the jugular. After having spent the day in singing hymns to the goddess of liberty, he wrote, the virtuous Democrat gets him home to his peaceful dwelling and sleeps with his property secure beneath his roof. Yeah, sometimes in his very arms. And when his industry has enhanced its value, it bears to a new owner the proofs of his democratic delicacy, unquote. Never was there anything in the world, he concluded, quoting again, never was there anything in the world that exhibited such a base, odious, and disgusting contrast as the professions and the conduct of this race of patriots. You might think from this that Cobbett himself favored emancipation. He did not. On the contrary, when he was back in England, he adopted a crude and ugly form of racism that makes for extremely unpleasant reading. His target was not slavery. His target was white American hypocrisy. Democracy then for Cobbett was associated with hypocrisy, unbridled ambition, the breakdown of the family, the tyranny of the majority, culminating inevitably in revolutionary terror. Remember, this was the most widely read pamphleteer and journalist in the United States in the 1790s. Democracy was associated with hypocrisy, unbridled ambition, the breakdown of the family, the tyranny of the majority, revolutionary terror. Anyone who doubted that need only cast their eyes across the Atlantic to France, where Jacobin demagogues mouthed slogans of liberty while ruthlessly crushing their enemies, where Christianity was replaced by the cult of the supreme being and the worship of Robespierre, where the country had been turned into, quote, a gloomy wilderness watered with rivers of human blood, unquote. And what happened in France could happen here, unless, quote, the just and humane people of the United States, unquote, stood up against the Jacobins in their midst. In contrast with this nightmarish vision of revolutionary France, Cobbett embraced an idealized and nostalgic image of old England as a model of peace, order, and good government. The British Constitution he saw as a harmonious whole in which the King, Lords, and Commons complemented each other rather than competed with each other. This was his image, with society being bound together between benevolent rulers and loyal subjects, resting on the accumulated wisdom of the ages rather than rights. The British Constitution had succeeded in securing prosperity, justice, and real liberty for its subjects. People were well fed. They enjoyed the freedom of the press. They were protected by an independent and impartial judicial system. This was Cobbett's England, an England that existed largely, if not completely, within his own imagination. Now, you might think, listening to this, that this would have been a hard sell in early Republican America. But he pulled it off. His pamphlets went into numerous editions. They circulated throughout the country. The newspaper he started, Porcupine's Gazette, reached over 3,000 subscribers. It far outstripped the sales of his closest competitors. His account book reveals that he had customers across the continent, from Republican Georgia to Loyalist Nova Scotia. So what are we to make of this? How can we explain this? First of all, we need to remember that something that I think isn't always appreciated. We need to remember that the American Revolution was really America's first civil war. John Adams reckoned that a third of Americans supported the revolution. A third. A third supported the Loyalists, he reckoned, and a third remained neutral. Now, many of the Loyalists left for Britain and British North America after the Revolution, and a lot of historical attention has been focused on them, especially in Canada. But many more stayed, and they kept their heads down. And then Cobbett came along. Cobbett, it is clear, spoke to their condition. But that wasn't all. Secondly, Cobbett appealed to many Federalists in the United States who were appalled by the French Revolution and who wanted closer political and economic ties with Britain. People who, from the perspective of the Republicans, were betraying the spirit of 1776. Perhaps surprisingly, Cobbett's writings were particularly popular in Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland. These were states where Republicans were rising most rapidly, rather than in Federalist strongholds like New England. Now, this could have been because, and this might come as a surprise to you, but it could have been because many of his enemies actually enjoyed reading him. He was a brilliant polemicist with a wicked sense of humor, and there are numerous instances of his targets commenting on his talents as a writer. More probably, though, it was because these were the areas, Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland, where politics were most polarized, where the Republicans were challenging established authority and the Federalists were being forced on the defensive. His uncompromising anti-Jacobinism and his aggressive tone perfectly matched the mood of people who feared that they were being cornered. Such readers, it is safe to say, were attracted more by Cobbett's denunciation of democracy than by his pro-British position. The characteristic Federalist response to his writings was one of ambivalence. Federalists rather liked his attacks on their Republican enemies, but they also wanted to distance themselves from Republican accusations that they were crypto-monarchists. Cobbett did not help in that cause. They welcomed Cobbett's anti-Jacobinism, but they were embarrassed by his Toryism. Thirdly, why was he read so widely? His writing style. His writing style shocked, titillated, and appealed to a broad audience. The medium was at least as important as the message. He combined Burkean politics with Swiftian satire, and he carried his arguments along in an apparently inexhaustible stream of personal invective, sheer vindictiveness, and scurrilous character sketches. His language was clear, forceful, direct, and energetic. It broke the barrier between things that were said on the street and things that were set down in print. I believe, wrote one of his enemies about his newspaper, I believe there never was a gazette so infamous for scurrility, abuse, cursing, swearing, and blasphemy, unquote. Fair enough, but there was more to it than that. Cobbett's skill lay in combining abuse with argument. It was a potent mixture, and some of his arguments were very much on point. His belief that actions should be assessed according to their probable consequences rather than first principles is well worth considering, especially in relation to the dangers of dogmatism. His critique of Jacobinism, for all its wild distortions and distensions, and they were there, did detect totalitarian tendencies within democratic ideology. His attacks on hypocrisy exposed the wide gap between Republican ideology and behavior, not least on the question of liberty and slavery. And some of his targets did indeed combine public pronouncements of high principles with under-the-table graft and corruption. All of these attacks were infused with a spirit of jovial ferocity. If satire is fueled by wide discrepancies between profession and practice, Cobbett had plenty to go on. So, wrapping up. Populism in the early republic existed on both the left and the right, and its origins cannot be reduced to the writings of one person. But, I would argue, in a very real sense, Cobbett was a founding father of right-wing American populism. He broke barriers. He set a tone and style that echoes through to the present, right down to character assassinations and assertions shouted in capital letters in print. He ticks just about every box in the populist playbook. Anti-intellectualism loomed large. Quote, "A cobbler with his hammers and awls is a more valuable acquisition than a dozen philosophy, theology, political empirics with all their boasted apparatus. Everyone, I hope, will have the goodness to believe," this is in relation to Ben Franklin's autobiography, "everyone will, I hope, have the goodness to believe that my grandfather was no philosopher." This is Cobbett's own autobiography, written at the age of 33. "Everyone will have the goodness to believe that my grandfather was no philosopher. Indeed, he was not. He never made a lightning rod, nor bottled up a single quart of sunshine in the whole course of his life. Joseph Priestley, whose scientific experiments included the discovery of oxygen, did more than bottle up quarts of sunshine. Quote, he set to work bottling up his own farts and selling them for superfine inflammable air," unquote. Ad hominem attacks ran through his writings. I never could see, he remarked, I never could see how abuses were to be corrected without attacking those to whom they were attributed. If swindling and debauchery prevails, how are you to check it without exposing the swindler and the debauchee? Benjamin Franklin was described as, quote, a whoremaster, a hypocrite, and an infidel, unquote. Benjamin Rush, with his belief that bleeding cured yellow fever, was called Dr. Sangrado and accused of unleashing a medical terror that slew thousands of Americans. When Cobbett learned that the Scottish Democrat Thomas Muir had been wounded in a naval battle and lost an eye, the response came with black humor. The rascal has lost one eye. So far, so good, unquote. This, then, was the populist world of William Cobbett, a world in which the anti-elitism was directed against Republican politicians, not least Thomas Jefferson. The conspirators were Democratic Republicans. The conspirators were Democratic Republicans who were supposedly plotting to bring the French Revolution to America, in which the stereotyping consisted of tarring Democratic Republicans with a brush of revolutionary terror, in which the nativism was directed against British and Irish emigrated patriots, who were accused of injecting their subversive ideas into the American bloodstream, in which the sense of urgency came from the conviction that the entire future of the United States hinged on decisions made now, in which the return to traditional values meant rejecting the French Revolution and recognizing and embracing the Englishness of the United States. It is a world that is both familiar and strange, when some elements of what are considered woke politics today, remaking the world according to first principles, adopting attitudes of moral superiority and certainty, assuming an elevated level of consciousness, believing that only fools or knaves could oppose your enlightened ideas, pulling down statues and renaming streets, infusing radical politics into education, medicine, language, literature, theater, gender relations, in which some elements of what are considered woke politics today were associated with Jeffersonian Republicans. And conservative populism found its most articulate and influential voice through a man whose aim was to make America great again by making America British again. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. What a interesting and thought-provoking speech, and I'm genuinely looking forward to the question and answers. I think this is going to be fantastic. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, go ahead and just raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is about this William Cobbett guy.
It's about Colin Cobbett, yep.
Yeah. In terms of his anti-democratic ethos and, you know, his whole his ideas and his whole effort and so forth in publishing, he actually seems to embody the radicalism of a new world with his
brilliant question.
with his, you know, writing style. Like, this is not Burkean rhetoric or something like this. Is not graceful and high and lofty. So in one sense, he can't even escape the very thing that he's criticizing. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, I'd love to comment on that. I think that's a brilliant observation. Thank you very much for that. It was noticed by some contemporaries. And actually, Mary Wollstonecraft said the same thing about Edmund Burke, not about style, but about his passion, and said, I could imagine you as a radical under different circumstances. Yes, there was definitely an ironic form of the seeds of New World radicalism, the plain style in Cobbett's work. And let me tell you the aftermath of Cobbett, which I didn't get into at all, which might take a minute or two, so please bear with me. But he wound up as a founding father of British popular radicalism, along with Tom Paine. It's an extraordinary story. He went back, he was forced out of America. Okay, this is going to be a longish answer. Please bear with me. I don't want to keep you here forever, but it's a good story. I think he was forced out of America after Benjamin Rush sued him for libel after that Dr. Sangrado comment. I wonder why. And the trial was something else. The trial took place in Philadelphia. Thomas McKean, the governor, who had been one of Cobbett's principal targets, he portrayed McKean as a henpecked, corrupt alcoholic, this kind of thing. Thomas McKean chose. He set everything up in the trial. He appointed his son-in-law, Edward Shippen, as the judge of the case. He appointed his close friend, Edward Shippen. Edward Shippen chose his son-in-law, his own son-in-law, as the prosecuting counsel. It was as cozy as Little Rock. It was stitched up completely. Cobbett was fined $5,000 for libel, which was like astounding for that time. The current equivalent's about $150,000. He could not afford that. So he got out of the United States in 1800. Spitting and fuming about the Americans. I'm leaving a country where pretended patriots do not with impunity break in and steal $5,000, something along those lines. And he goes to England and he lets out, you get his real views about the United States and the American Revolution, stuff he kept to himself. I mean, one of the first things he writes is, he writes about the American Rebellion. Then he puts in brackets, for I always like to call things by their right name. It was a rebellion, not a revolution. And he was initially feted by the British government. Why not? And he started his own newspaper, the Political Register. But then he learned in 1801 that the British government was opening negotiations with France for peace. It would become the Peace of Amiens in 1802. He was appalled by this because France was the epicenter of everything he was horrified by. And so he began to criticize the government for taking this position. And then he started asking himself, well, why is the government not behaving in a true patriotic way? And he came to the conclusion that it was the influence of finance that was doing it. The financiers had got hold of the government. And then he read Thomas Paine's Decline and Fall of the English System of Finance with his critique of the national debt and his argument that it would result in a revolutionary crisis. And Cobbett was converted, not to all Paine's views, to Paine's financial views. Cobbett then started to ask himself, how can we stop this corrupt cabal between politicians and financiers? And he became increasingly associated with parliamentary reformers. Didn't go anywhere. So then he tried to align himself with his idealized view of the ancient country gentleman. Didn't go anywhere. Then he put his faith in a patriot king. Didn't go anywhere either. Then in 1811, he found himself, never mind being fined $5,000, he was imprisoned for 2 years at Newgate for seditious libel in 1811. By the time he came out, he was even more radicalized, and he began to become increasingly impressed with Tom Paine, a return to Tom Paine, and by the time of the post-Napoleonic War period, when Britain was plunged into depression, and there was a great deal of popular radicalism around, he emerged as a central figure in English popular radicalism, now a convert to Tom Paine, and now an admirer of the American system that he denounced. But at the same time, it's very interesting. When you read his work, it took me a long while to figure this out when I was working on him, because you're getting mixed messages about America. You're reading in one place, America is a really, this is where liberty exists, and you're thinking, okay, I see the switch here, it's pretty clear. But then two copies of the newspaper later, you're getting, we've got to do everything in our power to eclipse the rising power of America. And you're thinking, well, what's going on? And of course, I realized it's because the model of old England and the English empire and prosperity and honor and everything that was his bedrock position. And if America, the example of American liberty, could help break the people he imagined were responsible for betraying Britain's destiny, then he would use American liberty as a means of doing that. But American rising mercantile power was a threat to what he wanted. So he had this very ambivalent position. And one coda to that is that in 1796, as Peter Porcupine, the populist conservative, he wrote an utterly scurrilous biography of Tom Paine. In 1819, driven out of Britain as an emigrated patriot himself, now living in Long Island in exile for 2 years, he writes another biography of Tom Paine, which is as adulatory as his earlier one was vituperative, and said that Tom Paine's bones should be dug up, brought back to England and given the funeral worthy of a reformer. And he did it himself. He dug up Tom Paine's bones, took them across the Atlantic, and he never carried through with his. He planned to lead them, to put them at the head of a march of thousands and tens of thousands of people to radicals, and then give them a public burial. And he never actually did it. The bones of Thomas Paine, common sense, lost. No one knows where they are. Thanks for your question. It's a great question. A very long answer.
So my question is, I wonder if, understanding that the French Revolution was the big deal politically, right, at that time, but I wonder, looking back, I mean, aren't the Federalists, the Jeffersonian Democrats, the Jacobins, maybe Cobbett himself too, aren't they all just varieties of Whigs? So, I mean, at least in the American context, right, you have, despite their differences, Federalists and Jefferson and Republicans, I mean, they all agreed on natural rights and natural law and such. There was no disagreement about that. I mean, even Edmund Burke believed in natural rights too. So I'm wondering, is it right to characterize it, and I understand you're doing it provocatively, far right, far left, right? But I'm wondering if that's a wrong way of characterizing it, because ultimately they all agree on the same first principles.
Yeah, so it's a very, very good observation. Thank you for that. They don't all agree on first principles. Cobbett was not a Whig. He rejected the notion of balance, for example. He didn't want competing orders. He wanted a harmonious organic society as his ideal. The others, yes, they're definitely operating within a common worldview. At the same time, I think that does not preclude intense differences over the meaning of Whiggery, and that's what we're seeing here. There were many people, such as Joseph Priestley, who feared that the United States was on the brink of a civil war in the 1790s. So within that commonality, it seems to me that the issue I have with that is a commonality is so broad that it can encompass just about anything, including vitriolically opposed groups. Now, on the provocative element of this, yes, absolutely, there's a provocative element in this. I want to provoke some interesting responses. At the same time, what really struck me when I returned to this topic, because I've been working on Irish-Canadian history for the last 2 decades, I've done the work on this earlier, what really struck me when I returned to this topic was how familiar and yet how different this world was, particularly with the radical Democrats, and just how polarized the situation was. And it was, I think. So I hold to the notions of the far left and the far right, but within a broad Whig culture, which may seem to you as a sort of mealy mouth way of getting around it, or may not. I don't know, but that's how I see it. But I think it's a very good observation. And people can. I think about, if I can just briefly say, I think about Ireland and which I've been working on a lot, and you could say that northern, or you can say Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants actually have a lot in common. They really do, but they're actually divided precisely by what they have in common. And I think that's what's going on here.
I wanted to ask about, it seems like Cobbin is responding to a French-style American democracy. And to me, that does seem to accord well with BLM, woke politics, whatever you want to call it, whatever's going on at the moment. Whereas if you look at the more like foundational thing in America was such a fundamental break in the way it was founded. Nothing really like that had been done before. And so everything after it was sort of trying to copy it and then take it a step further. And in a way, it feels like it fails because they don't have the same context or the same ability to say, okay, we were British, but now we're on a different continent than Britain, and we're not part of England anymore, and we're going to start our own thing. In France, there's like, we're just not the old regime anymore. We're going to kill everybody. But it's still France. It's still the same land. It's still the same people, fundamentally. And then they're like, oh, yeah, we like what they're doing in France. We're going to move it here. And both of them fail, right? The French Revolution in like the number of days in the week, that weird thing they did, and the when they restarted counting the years, the religion of reason, all of these different things failed. They failed here. They failed there. It feels like the American Revolution and the example of like the American dictionary, for example, that is revolutionary, but it was a part of the revolution in a certain way, not a part of the later revolution. I'm wondering if that distinction is important in understanding them and how you would look at the question of French democracy versus American democracy versus modern wokeism.
I think that's another third excellent observation. And I think you're quite right. This is, as you put it, French-style American democracy. That's exactly what's going on here. And there is, in Cobbett's part, a significant element of that populist stereotyping, that you take the most radical features of Democrats and you say, this is what the Republicans are like, and it's just, that's a wild distortion, I mean, there are elements of it within republicanism. That quotation from Thomas Jefferson from 1793, I find very chilling. There are elements of it there. And it seems in the 1790s like this is going to be the mainstream, which is why Cobbett reacted so strongly against it, and why many Federalists cheered Cobbett's denunciations of democracy on. It seemed like it was, but you're quite right to point out, again, context is crucial to go back to that point, and we're in a very different context here. And this is something that Edmund Burke recognized, the difference between and recognized it very early, the difference between the American Revolution as an act of secession, there are elements of social radicalism within it, but it was primarily an act of secession. You have Alexander Hamilton in the 1790s saying the British Constitution is the most perfect government in the world. So you get Edmund Burke got that, just as Edmund Burke in 1790 got what was going to happen in the French Revolution. I'll just say just a little word on that too, taking it slightly away from your question, but. Edmund Burke is often seen in Reflections as someone who had remarkable powers of clairvoyance. And I'd say yes and no to that, because his analysis of the French Revolution, which came much earlier than anyone else, his critique came much earlier than anyone else's, but that analysis was based, getting back to the earlier question, on classic Whig theory. The checks and balances, right, between monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And if you wind up in a situation as you were, which you could see happening in France, monarchy is being truncated, aristocracy is being truncated, you wind up with unchecked democracy, which you can equate to French-style democracy. And that can only end in war and dictatorship, which was classic Whig theory. So he was actually, in some senses, very original. In other senses, he was following a well-established line of thought. But yes, I agree with your point. Context is crucial, and both failed. French revolutionary style democracy fails in France at a terrible cost in human life, and it fails in America without a civil war. Thank goodness. And in retrospect, you could say, well, America wasn't close to a civil war in the 1790s, but at the time, for many, the fear was very real. Thank you.
So thank you so much for this talk, and in particular, the incredible quotes that you brought are they're going to haunt me forever. It's truly wonderful that they're here. And I have to read more William Cobbett. This is something I've learned. But I'm particularly interested in something that you noted about Cobbett's work, which is that he tapped into a group of people no one was listening to.
Yes.
And if there's one thing that I've heard about Donald Trump's particular brand of politics is that he spoke to people that had been forgotten in politics. And so I'll lay some cards on the table and say I'm a huge fan of Edmund Burke, and I occasionally get mocked for it by some people in the room. Just saying, not mentioning any names, but they're in the room, so everyone
I'm sure
guess.
that will come out later.
Well, and one thing that I think that he got absolutely right is that a government that functions well as an organic unity is one that attends to the various interests that are at play. And when you start neglecting an interest, this is when things start to get really dangerous. I think that's behind a lot of his writings about the Irish Catholic reforms, about what was happening in America. I mean, he thought they would probably break off long before they actually did because their interests were neglected. And so this idea of capturing this voice that it happened before in such an explicit sense is fascinating to me. And so I'm wondering if you can look at any of those historic parallels, and not that I would ask you to gaze into a crystal ball, but I'm wondering how that ended up resolving itself, if at all. I mean, if it just petered out, if the ideologies, the paradigm shifted. I'm just wondering, what one could reasonably expect to happen with the likewise polarized time now, because it seems that the exact same sort of thing is happening, that people who have been neglected by the political system are being spoken to now by populists, by people who are checking all of those boxes. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. That's another excellent observation and question. I'm glad you like the quotations. I'm very happy to pass on the paper to you if you want to get more haunted by them. Tapping into people to whom no one was listening. I do think that's a parallel. But in the case of the 1790s, are very different people. Loyalists and the appeal there. And I'm sure for loyalists who had to keep their heads down and behave one way and think another, I'm sure Cobbett was a huge release for them. And it's something that's very hard to get at. If I was going to return to this period, I'd be very interested in pursuing that. Loyalists in America. Some work's been done on loyalists, the Loyalist Federalist Alliance, as it's known, in the British North American Maritimes and New England. I mean, even during the War of 1812, you had that this informal alliance. Yes, people who are not being listened to, part of it. Burke, I'll get to all of your points, I hope. Conor Cruise O'Brien wrote a superb biography of Edmund Burke, The Great Melody, in which these themes that you mention are developed at considerable length and with, in my view, considerable acuity. Ireland, India, America, France. And to do a sort of elevator version of a very fine 550-page book, the underlying principle that Conor Cruise O'Brien sees, if principle is the right word, the underlying animating force in Burke is hostility to the abuse of power. That's the common ground that he sees through all of this. Parallels with the present day. Actually, I was discussing this before the talk with Rob and Alan, and I just don't know nobody knows what's going to happen. But what did happen in the 1790s? What did happen? Everyone here, I'm sure, is very familiar with this, the very closely fought election of 1800 and Jefferson coming to power. And we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. Not, of course, everyone agreed with that. I found it very interesting. And again, everything's been portrayed so far in my talk has been, because it's reflecting the polarized politics of the time, everything's been portrayed in a very polarized fashion. But then, as now, there was much more common ground than one might realize. And I think Jefferson was able to tap into that. When I was working on the United Irishmen, Irish revolutionaries in the United States, one of the things that I encountered were different degrees of radicalism within the United Irishmen. The more respectable United Irishmen were toasting Jefferson and supporting his victory, and liked, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. The more radical United Irishmen were appalled by it, but they became increasingly a minority voice. They had to adjust to the new situation, and they wind up fighting amongst themselves. And this is what I think increasingly happens. The French Revolution has demonstrably failed by the early 19th century, so that is no longer there. The idea of France as a source of inspiration, or for Federalists and Conservatives a source of horror, that's gone. So the increasing concern is English naval power and the continued presence of British power in the Northwest. This is what Jay's Treaty is intended to break. So you tend to get much more sort of cohesion now focused against Britain in this new context. All of which I suppose is to say, you just never know what's going to happen, and you never know about contingency. And one of my favorite historians, although I find myself disagreeing with him a lot of the time, is A.J.P. Taylor, who wrote on the First World War and did several biographies of Beaverbrook, and wrote on the Second World War. A very colorful, controversial figure, a terrific writer and speaker. And A.J.P. Taylor opined that history is all accident. Now that's classic Taylor. He takes something with a large element of truth and then turns it into an absolute just to get people going. So I think there's a lot in that. And I think about the discipline of history. There's a little-known philosopher of history by the name of Gordon Leff, who argued a good number of years ago that causality in history was very misleading, because once you start thinking in terms of causality, you're actually assuming an outcome and then going back to explain it. So there's an implicit determinism in causality. Instead, he posited the notion of contingency, an awareness that things could go many different ways. And the task of the historian, rather than to think only in terms of causality, is to make history intelligible. And part of making it intelligible is an awareness that very different things could have happened. It didn't have to turn out the way it did. Which way our current situation will turn out, who dies suddenly, what happens in the international scene, what happens in the South China Sea, what happens in Ukraine. There's so many imponderables. And people will look back on our era and assume there's a clear course. Oh, this was going, well, none of us know. And I think we really need to remember that when we are studying history. We know that how things turned. It's an obvious point, but it's often forgotten. We know how things turned out. They didn't. So we cannot understand their world without realizing they had no idea what was going to happen. Thank you.
Thanks. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
So thinking about Cobbett,
C-O-B-B-E-T-T.
Cobbett.
Yeah.
And actually Alexis de Tocqueville, it seems that they came to very similar conclusions on the nature of democracy and debasing and just the dangers of it. Mm-hmm. But they came to very different conclusions about American families.
Yes.
And I'm curious as to why you think that is. Is Cobbett, is it just because of his personal experiences with his family, or was it, maybe different backgrounds? Tocqueville's French.
Yeah.
Anyways,
I think different backgrounds are important. I don't think at this stage his own experiences with his family were a factor, although I don't know. The attempted suicide and sons turning against him took place in the late 1820s and 1830s, so that was much later. He died in 1835. But I think the unifying image for Cobbett, which helps to explain his emphasis on organic sort of families and the patriarchy that he believed in, I think that stems actually from his own upbringing in a relatively prosperous hop-growing area of Sussex in England, where people were reasonably well fed and where social relations deference was part of the world. Everyone knew their place. I mean, he was probably idealizing this too, because he ran away as soon as he could, by the way. But I think that was his image, this idealized version of his childhood that was carried through. I think it's very different from Tocqueville's views. And also, I think there's a very strong reactive element. That if you get articles in the Aurora, or you get Mary Wollstonecraft, he hated Mary Wollstonecraft. He wrote, well, women should never become involved in politics because it ages them terribly. Just look at Mary Wollstonecraft. She had a fine head of brown hair when she began the Vindication of the Rights of Women, and it was entirely grey by the time she finished it. He had this kind of stuff. It was all sort of mocking stuff that he did, I think he found that very threatening to his ideal image, the contrast between his own personal experiences and the image, it came much later. So I'm not sure if that's a great answer to your very good question, but there is a very significant difference, and I think it's rooted in Cobbett's own form of Toryism, because even when he was a founding father of English popular radicalism, he was a Tory, because that was the goal, using radical means to go back to a Tory image of society. Totally unrealizable. Just as any hopes he may have had of reversing the American Revolution was totally unrealizable. But I think that was part of the picture.
First of all, thank you for your frankly enthralling talk.
Thank you.
It was amazing, really. So I noticed throughout there's kind of an undercurrent of anti-populism here, right? Of the dangers of populism. But I wonder, as an American, I feel pulled both to the far left and far right in this situation. Aren't they both right? I don't much like spelling color and honor with a U, or having King and Queen Street.
At last, the voice of sanity.
Statues of earls and all that. That sounds pretty good. And on the other hand, isn't Cobbett right? Aren't Jefferson and maybe even Madison, I guess more Jefferson, pretty radical and going over to France and saying, hey, this whole revolution thing looks pretty great. We really like this. And then, on the hypocrisy side, it seems very accurate. Jefferson embargoes Haiti after the Haitian Revolution, and then after Jefferson is gone, the 19th century Jeffersonians, they become kind of radical slaveocrats in a way. This is how you get Calhoun, right? So anyway, I was just wondering kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, another great question. Undercurrents of anti-populism. I thought this was overtly anti-populist. That the approach that I've taken is one that is, I hope, if I was successful, equally critical of ideological intolerance on the left and conservative populism on the right. I think there is a sensible left and there is a sensible right, and I think there's a lot of common ground too. So no, I did try and point out that Cobbett was on point for some things. That he can't just be dismissed as a sort of a caricature, a buffoon, someone who was all style and no substance. There was actually, within these assumptions that he had, there's, I think, a lot of substance to Cobbett, and yes, his critique, as I said at the beginning, half the lies are true. His critique of the more extreme elements of Jeffersonian republicanism was often dead on, and sometimes widely distorted. And tarring everyone with the same brush was one of his rhetorical strategies. Myself, as will have been made clear, I am extremely disturbed by populism, whether on the left or on the right, and I combine. This is probably a views that may not be universally shared, But I'm a social democrat who believes in John Stuart Mill style liberalism. I believe in open debate. I don't believe in cancelling. You know, I don't like ideological intolerance on either side of the political spectrum. I think both are very dangerous. And I think what we need to do is try and find common ground. And this is probably idealistic and naive, but rather than winning arguments against people who are deemed to be the other side, saying, okay, what are your views? What are my views? Where do we differ? And where do we agree? And let's respectfully agree to disagree. Unless we can find some kind of forum that gets away from the social media rage machine, that gets away from TV shows that pit one person against another. It's like cockfighting from the 18th century. This is not helpful. You know, I mean, it's great. It's great for ratings, and it's great for social media attention. You stir things up, and you use the clickbait. You're in. This is very disturbing to me. I don't know what could be done about it. I was talking earlier about before this talk began about the social media of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and how worried the authorities were in Britain, as well as among the Federalists in the United States, how worried they were about untrammeled popular information. And in Britain, between 1790s right up to 1836, there was a major tax put on popular newspapers that cost a penny or twopence. There was a mega tax to keep them out of reach of the general public, the uneducated, swinish multitude, if you like. You know, by the way, Edmund Burke, who I sense is not your hero, Edmund Burke. I'm the guy that makes fun. Okay, Edmund Burke, as an aside, did not describe all the people as a swinish multitude. He used that in a very specific context. When it wasn't the swinish multitude, it was a swinish multitude in a particular context. But yes, I find the social media rage and the very disturbing. But it's not the first time we've been through that. It's not the first time. There were equal fears during the period of the late 18th, early 19th centuries about the impact of cheap popular newspapers on the polity. It was only in 1836, when things seemed to be safer, that tax was repealed.
Thank you very much for that. You mentioned in your talk immigration briefly, and I know that you're fully aware of this, having read your books on the 1798 rebellion in Ireland and the immigration that came over. Could you talk about any parallels that you see with our open border to the south now and its possible impact on populism here, and the Irish migration that came after the 1798 rebellion? The fears amongst the Federalists was that those Irishmen would all vote for Jefferson, and they wanted to shut that down. As you know, I just wanted to know if you could elaborate on that for me.
Yeah, the fears were that they would all vote for Jefferson, and those fears were not entirely accurate, but largely accurate. The United Irish emigres in the 1790s played a huge part. I don't exaggerate it. The Irish always tend to exaggerate their own influence over things, but played a very large part. Well, a large part. See, I'm just dialing it down each time. A large part in Jefferson's victory in 1800, through their control of newspapers. I mean, everywhere they went, they got printer's ink on their hands. You know, they were starting up newspapers left, right, and center, and they were all Jeffersonian ones. Yes, there was Rufus King, the American minister in London, tried to stop leading United Irishmen from coming into the United States, with some success, actually, in 1798. So that fear was there, and there was. I mean, it's interesting as well. You know, people generally think about nativism and Irish American nationalism, for that matter, and the mid-19th century. Well, both were there in this period. Irish American nationalism is born during this period. And nativism isn't exactly born in this period, but because there were earlier examples. But there is a great deal of nativism directed against United Irishmen. And again, it's on the part of Federalists. And it's, again, our way of life is being undermined. That's the fear. So going to the present day, I think one of the major aspects of illegal immigration, which we don't have very much of in Canada, I have to say. So, but I realize that's an issue here, and as it has been in parts of Europe as well. One of the major issues is that if you wind up in a situation where there are large numbers of illegal immigrants, you're almost certain to get a populist backlash against that, a nativist backlash against that. As, for example, has happened in Sweden, really good example of this, and other Scandinavian countries for that matter. And if you get that kind of backlash and parties, strong anti-immigrant parties on the right coming to power, those immigrants are going to be given a very rough ride anyway. So it would seem to be prudent, in most general terms, to be aware of this, that everything you stand for as a liberal, for example, could come crashing down in the context of untrammeled immigration. Having said that, at the same time, there were a lot of unfair stereotypes made about the Irish. As you well know, Protestant Irish as well as Catholic Irish, lazy, feckless, drunk, all of these first applied to Protestants and later to Catholics. And I think we need to be very, very wary of, and indeed hostile to, stereotyping immigrants. I see a lot of that as well, and that I see it then and I see it now.
All right. Well, let's give Dr. Wilson a warm thank you for this really stimulating talk.
Thanks, Dave. All right. Thank you.